Welcome back to the Lincoln Project. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by veteran political reporter Tom LoBianco, the author of the 24-site Substack newsletter. In 2 decades of reporting, Tom spent 8 years covering Donald Trump, 12 years covering Mike Pence, with tours from the campaign trail to the White House and all points in between. Prior to 24-site, he covered politics for The Messenger, Yahoo News, Business Insider, CNN, and the Associated Press. He is also the author of the 2019 Mike Pence biography, Piety and Power, available wherever fine books are sold. Today, he's coming to us from Manchester, New Hampshire, right off the heels of the primary there last night. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Reed. Thanks for having me.
All right, so it is, as we're recording this, 8:35 a.m. Eastern Time, the day after the New Hampshire primary. Donald Trump wins by 12, beats Nikki Haley. I don't think it's any surprise that, he's on his way to the Republican nomination. Nikki Haley was not quite defiant in defeat, but certainly said she's going to continue moving on. And Trump was defiant in victory. So give us the tales from the ground.
Yeah, it feels like the zombie primary continues. I'm not sure how long, possibly sometime before South Carolina. That was really interesting. A lot of my focus up here, in a lot of the political media industrial complex focus, was really on what would be the margin of victory for Trump here. Would he, land that knockout punch in the primary, or would Haley get it close enough within single digits to, really call it a victory? And, I think when you hear people talk about these things in the moment, you hear stuff like complaints about the projections in Iowa, the race being called before, people are still voting in caucus. A lot of that has to do with the expectations game. Obviously, it's central to presidential politics. But I think, I tend to step back and take an even broader view of it and look at where the Republican Party is, because this is supposed to be a party unilaterally controlled by Trump. And it was pre-January 6th, not that long ago, where it really was. And, as much of that was a result of him controlling the White House as anything. But just, if you hop in a time machine back to the heady days of November 2020, when Rudy Giuliani was still a joke, and before the hair dye started dripping down, and before we had an insurrection at the Capitol, and tell anybody that Trump does not have unilateral control over the Republican Party. That would be stunning. But again, is it enough for Nikki Haley to actually win a nomination? And that appears to be no. We're stuck in this middle ground right now.
Yeah, I actually wrote on my notes here the expectations game, Tom, because again, you're right. It's, the Trump campaign, as you know, on any campaign in a contest, you're trying to, tamp down expectations and then exceed them, right? It also happens in debate settings, right? Like say, look, we're just trying to go out and make our message, yada, yada, yada. We're up against a very stiff competition. Then you score a few points. You go, look at what a great job our person did, right? Yes. And so, you can make an argument to your point about the quote unquote control of the party. And I think it's important that we make a distinction here between the control of the party and sway over voters, because I think it's an important distinction. Trump clearly thought that he was going to win by more, or should have won by more, and that Haley had audacity in even saying, I did better, or I made enough of a move here that I should continue. And so he goes into not one of, let's now bring us all together, right, as Republicans, Reagan's 11th commandment, but she's wearing a cheap dress. The opposition research is going to start dropping on her. She's not very smart. All the other things, which frankly, as someone like me and like you who's been watching him as long as we have, none of that was a surprise in particular.
No, not at all. I mean, Trump is Trump, as they say. Yeah, and he kind of undercut himself there, but he also gave it away, right? I mean, he gave away what the expectation was. I mean, stunning to see that, a guy just, 8 days ago in Iowa said it's time to wrap things up. And, granted, he has been saying that for months without effect. Although I would argue the effect really kicked in. So I'm reconsidering this here. The effect did kick in after Iowa. You got the cavalcade of endorsements. You had the sad, sad, sad campaign of Ron DeSantis finally with her, with a video at the end, and some really big words, big promises after, dropping out. Tim Scott's out, gets engaged, supplicates before Trump at the victory speech there.
Can we just stop there for a second, Tom? So what Tom is referring to, everyone, is at Trump's, I guess, victory speech last night, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, who Nikki Haley appointed to his seat, let's be clear, when she was governor of South Carolina, Trump turns back and says, wow, you really must hate her, referring to Nikki Haley to have endorsed me, to which Scott sort of sheepishly goes, I just love you. And it was such... I wasn't surprised by it, right? And you see, as Tom is two people who probably spend entirely too much time looking at political social media. Everybody's like, can you believe it? Can you believe it? What he's pathetic. Like, yes, you can absolutely believe it. Like, none of this was a surprise. And let's also be clear that Trump has never not taken an opportunity to make someone feel worse about a decision they should feel bad about.
Tim Scott, there was a moment where people thought maybe he had a chance, but again, this is where the party is, and there's no going back. Trump, what it looked like last night is it sounded like the guy who was in the White House. That's how he sounded, and when you look at people like Vivek Ramaswamy, and Tim Scott up there on stage with him. Clearly not DeSantis, which could turn out to be pretty interesting as this develops. Clearly they're looking for something out of a potential Trump administration. They're looking for support from his base. They're looking for some kind of, the magic political word here, relevance. And he kind of gives it to them. But man, the backhanded and the way that Scott announced his engagement after that too.
This is where, again, as you cross, Tom, to the extent that you and I occupy any space in the real world, as you cross from where we live to what I believe is some semblance of reality, as you step through that reality distortion field, right? Like, this all makes sense in the context of MAGA. Vivek Ramaswamy wants, he just, look, you're right. Like, he never expected he'd be here, right? He probably sees himself as an heir to like the FU, sort of mantra. Scott, he's like, all right, well, I'm all in. I might as well be on the stage with him. But again, this is the other thing too, is someone who you have covered Trump, Pence, their White House. They're so incredibly weird too. There's such a strange collection of people that only, I will say this, an authoritarian movement would allow to rise through the ranks, because no normal functioning human coalition would have anything to do with most of these people.
You remember, right? The back in 2016, the Trump folks used to call themselves the Island of Misfit Toys.
Right.
And you still kind of got that. This current iteration, by the way, is very much establishment, I should note, right? This is Susie Wiles, co-chair, Chris LaCivita, a veteran of Republican contests. He has been around for forever.
Right, which I always remind people, he is the Swift boat guy, so do not underestimate Chris's ability to do bad things.
Yes, and he's great at working us in the press.
Oh, for sure.
As is Trump, by the way. Trump is a master at working the press. I feel like that doesn't get out there enough. He's just really good.
Look, but I think if for someone who watches this stuff and reads all the coverage, again, is probably spending too much time on it. If you're paying attention, it absolutely comes through. There was somebody from, I don't know, it wasn't Trump himself, but a reporter on one of the cable networks was asking somebody about Trump's moderating stance on abortion. And it was a Democrat who was answering the question. I'm sorry, I got myself confused. And the person's like, what do you mean moderating stance on abortion? He's the guy who goes out and says, I killed Roe. I killed Roe. What are you talking about? Right? But like you got Lasavita out there going, he's really not as bad on abortion as you all say. Right? And everyone's thinking, you know what, Chris, you're right. Maybe you're right, because we all know that he doesn't really care. But he goes out and says it anyway. And as I said to, on the air last night, like, you know what? If my Democratic friends, not yours, if my Democratic friends are smart, they'll take when he says I killed Roe or I created the Supreme Court, and they'll run it 187 billion times into the suburbs, right? Like you can't, like, this is where, again, the press, not surprisingly, no offense, I call it media training, right? You guys live inside the reality distortion field too. It's one of your own making. And then when that Venn diagram between you guys and Trump comes together, right? It's like, what the hell are y'all talking about? No offense, of course.
The MAGA celebrity world, right? I mean, we write about things like, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz as though they are the be all end all. Well, the second coming of Trump, as it were, eventually. And which Trump kid. But the thing I was hearing from Trump folks last night, and this goes to his speech, where he really undercuts himself by attacking Haley. If he had given the speech he gave in Iowa, I think there might be a better claim to him saying the primary is over. But instead he gives a speech, setting her up as the opponent, keeping her up as the opponent, attacking her, promising more attacks. And that was because they didn't perform as well as expected in New Hampshire. In any normal circumstance, 12 points would be a blowout. This is clearly not a normal circumstance. He's kind of like a semi-incumbent, here. It's a very weird dynamic. And remember, the polling too had him gaining. With DeSantis dropping out, he was breaking away from Haley. So there was I heard a lot of frustration from Trump sources yesterday, current and veterans of Trump's previous campaigns. And I think you saw that reflected in his anger in that speech.
I mean, look, all politics and all campaigns have backbiting. The people who were there before saying, well, if I was there, this would have been different. The difference is in Trump world is that the knives are out all the time for everyone. And as I've said before, Tom, as you know, probably up close, the only people they hate more than me are each other, right? Like, so it's always this backbiting. So right now, somewhere between, New York City and Mar-a-Lago, there's a lot of people texting Trump, calling Trump. And this is the other part too, Tom, as you know, which is so unusual, is that he answers these calls. He answers these texts. He's not, and this is what I like. This is what we've seen since the beginning is, it's to your point about it not being a normal campaign. This is one of those things we always have to remind ourselves of. His campaign starts and ends with him, right? If let's say that it was the flip side, which is Joe Biden was in the position of Trump and he won by 12. And people, first of all, I doubt that, like, even if Joe Biden had a cell phone, somebody's holding it for him. But my point is, like, because he's the president, right? He's not holding his own cell phone, whereas Trump walks around with it in his pocket. So every foreign intelligence service knows where he is and is probably listening in on his conversations. But he answers these things individually and responds to them individually and then goes on Truth Social. So it's like, everything that happens, he's the head of the snake, and the rest of the snake has to respond to it, because again, it's all about him. There's no without him, there's no there, if that makes sense.
Yes, right. This third iteration of the campaign is fascinating for its bifurcation. This split personality of the campaign, where you have the establishment running it. And what you just said, which is Trump, the establishment is handling operations. Trump is directing it. And on the phone with Lewandowski, is talking with Roger Stone.
Jared's lurking.
Jared is in the wings. Very much so. Come back at any time. And it's, that old saw about, do you let Trump be Trump? I mean, all the things that we used to hear about in 2016 when he was in the White House. We kind of got that answer here. And, letting him be him results in a professional campaign with a former president tweeting threats, or I'm sorry, tweeting, not truth, whatever the hell that is, that one.
Right. It's functionally the same thing.
Yeah, he's writing. This is the way I think about it as a reporter, or somebody came up with press releases and faxes and whatnot. I hate writing, tweeting, and posted on social media and all that. That guy was the president. He's the current frontrunner for the nomination again. He could be the president again. He might not leave if he gets back in. All these things are possibilities. It's not a tweet. It's a statement.
It's a statement, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, right? Like you print them out, you put a ream of them in the Donald Trump Presidential Library, whatever, on the Fifth Avenue. These are things of import.